Welcome to our second mediations talk of the winter term 2024. Though thankfully doesn't feel very winter-like out there right now, as un-Canadian as is of me to say. I'm going to turn the floor over to Sina in a moment to do the land acknowledgement, introduce our speaker. But before Sina comes up, because of the technology in this room, this is a smart room and it's very sensitive, such that if you any side conversation or pen clicking or chair shuffling, we don't want you necessarily to be on camera just because you're adjusting your pen. So just try to keep background noise to the minimum, and then Sina, come on up.
Okay, so first I need to begin with the land acknowledgement. So we acknowledge that Western University is located on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Chonokton nations on lands connected with the London Township and Sombra treaties of 1796 and the Litchfield Monsoon Covenant 1. This land continues to be home to diverse indigenous peoples, First Nation, Metis, and Inuit, whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of the land and vital contributors of our society. Now okay, so good friend Pinar. Pinar is a second-year library and information science PhD student studying the construction of datasets for machine learning applications. Their main research goal is to minimize the harmful societal effects of artificial intelligence systems by understanding how social values become embedded in the model training process. Before starting the PhD program, Pinar was a research associate for the Fairness and Ethics in AI-Human Interaction Multidisciplinary Research Group at the CYENS Center of Excellence. Pinar has a BA in Culture Studies and Communication and MA in Interaction Design and brief experience in the industry as a user experience and service designer.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. It is, I have to say, flattering, but a little nerve-wracking to have so many of you here. So thank you for taking time out of your day to be here. But I also want to specifically thank our guests from the Netherlands, who are very jet-lagged and I hope don't fall asleep during this. They are raising their coffees. So yeah, as my good friend Sina already said, I am a second-year PhD student here. And we have what we call qualifying exams, or comps for short. So this is kind of part of that. Not that my comps is finished, but it is, this is sort of an introduction to why I'm doing the research that I'm doing and what it exactly means. So I'm hoping to sort of give you this introduction and also have this guide the rest of my comps process. So the faculty in the room, please give me your feedback about this as well, because that would be really helpful going forward for me. But yeah, and I also know that we have a range of expertise levels in the room when it comes to AI, especially because my mom is also here, who I have to say has a little bit less knowledge than those of you with a computer science degree. So I'm trying to cater to both sides of that spectrum. So bear with me if it's something that's too simple, but also bear with me if it's too complicated for you. I hope you will all find a little bit of something for you. So my argument today is going to be that, first of all, AI applications can cause harm. Data is a core part of the AI development process. And because of this, data is or can be a big reason for harm. So therefore, data handling really needs to be studied. So bear with me as I talk about this through 4 different sections. So first, I'm gonna set the ground so that we're on the same page about what role data plays in AI development. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about what dirty and raw data are, And just to give you a little teaser, it is the name people give to data that needs cleaning or processing. And we're gonna talk about what that means. Then we're gonna sort of link all of that dirtiness and rawness to people, going back to the ethics. So why is this important in the context of ethical AI? And then hopefully I'm going to be ending with a good argument for charting a path through research for a change towards a little bit more ethical AI development. So that said, let's get into the role of data in AI development. And this is where the computer scientists in the room can take a really tiny nap. And please don't judge me for how simplistic this is. But yeah, so machine learning is one of the most common techniques today to develop AI applications. And it uses statistics to look for patterns in the data. And it uses that to build sort of a model for something that you might want to predict. So for example, if I have these pictures and I have labels on them, like tree, car, shoe, books, shoe, my cat Gavira, cake, etc. I can use these to train an AI application to recognize something like shoes. So here, this data set would be called a training data set because I am using it to train the machine. I have to say this is overly simplified, very basic example. Real image data sets can go up to like billions, and I mean billions of pictures. So this is an extremely simple example, but I hope it will make the point still. So if I'm training an AI to look for things like shoes, then the AI is going to take all the data that is labeled as shoes in the training data set, and it's going to look for things that might be in common in all of these, and what might set these pictures apart from the rest of the data that is not labeled as shoes. So what is different between this group and the group that has trees? So it is going to use all of these things, sort of like a checklist, to see if some other new photo that I've shown this AI is a shoe or not. So if I show this one, it's gonna say, okay, that looks pretty similar to these shoes. Some of them less similar, but generally, okay, I think this is a shoe, and it's going to be correct. So essentially what it's doing, it's taking this new photo and it's comparing it to the model, which means it's comparing it to the photos that we already have in the training data set. Now, what if the shoes that I show our AI don't look like the ones that we have in our data set? What if it's made of a different material? Or it's only one shoe? Or the background isn't white? Or an actual person is wearing it? Or it's mismatched? They have larger heels or no heels? They have toes or lights, or a different pattern, or they're boots, or they're really, really modern, or they're for a different species. So, and this is not even just the only examples, right? What if they're actually photos from your own life? So they don't even look like these staged professional photographs of shoes, right? So what's gonna happen is that none of our shoes with these examples would be recognized because we've only trained the AI using shoes that are actually very similar to each other in the pattern point of view of machine learning, right? Statistically, they are so similar to each other that it doesn't make sense that they are the same type of thing as these ones. So, and this is only one of the many ways that what we call biases can be introduced into data sets and then go on to be shown in the outputs of an AI. What happens is that the patterns in our data set, whether we want them to or not, can appear in the outputs. And of course, one of the good ones is you find the pattern that I want, which is a shoe, in the new data. But what if there's a pattern, like what happened with Amazon's hiring algorithm, a popular example today, which is where they used previous successful applicants for Amazon, who happen to be mostly men, as examples of a good employee or a good applicant. So the pattern there was that, well, most of the good applicants are men. So machine learning algorithms actually ended up learning, okay, so if they have a women's college on their CV, it's actually not a good candidate. So all these patterns that we don't actually want can also get into our algorithm. So because data has such a critical role and can lead to this kind of unfairness and bias and harm, people have come up with common terms to identify data that needs cleaning and processing, which, as I mentioned, are dirty and raw. So let's talk about that a little bit. So data, just because it's a picture or it's numbers, doesn't mean that it is objective or it's unproblematic or it's somehow divorced from the human factors or the context or the perspectives around us. The way that people decide to measure something, to categorize it or to record it, can put human values into that data set as well. And I want to give you an example just to demonstrate what that means. So here we have a picture of a tree, right? And you might associate this tree with life and nature. So if I show you these pictures, these would be a loss, a death, right? Because it's life being lost. But you can also look at this tree and see it as wood, as raw material for houses and furniture. So then the pictures would actually be lumber. It would be honest work. So this is two ways of looking at the same data through different values. So the way that you label things, the way that you name them, can have implications for what they're used or how they're perceived. So again, if you have a photo, whatever value you have will somehow appear in your data set if you're the one labeling. This is actually also something that I've noticed in a very small anecdote where one of the reasons I can't wear leather jackets is because in my native language, Turkish, the word for leather is the same word as skin. So there is no way to separate the material leather from its source, an animal, right? So this tells me that people who label leather in Turkish have a very different concept and very different values when it comes to labeling the same leather jacket as someone who might be doing it in English, right? So apart from this, there could be just societal or environmental reasons that your data actually already has biases. So looking at this data, you might say, okay, so more people were born that were left-handed after about 1900s. That's interesting. Like, isn't anyone looking into why this is happening? Is it the water? Is it the food? Turns out it's just because being left-handed used to be something, especially during the Victorian era, that was stigmatized because everything is made essentially for people who are right-handed. So people who are left-handed, who are nodding intensely, have trouble using certain things. And especially during, when people had to work in factories, they would get into accidents a lot more often. So it became something that was not only stigmatized, but something that people were either forced to or chose to move away from. They would try to use their right hand for everything, even though it wasn't dominant, or they would at least report that they were left-handed, they were not left-handed because of the stigma. So And actually, I want to point out also that whenever we have discussions like this, people who are ambidextrous don't really get brought up, right? I don't know what percentage of the population is ambidextrous, but the fact that we don't talk about them also tells me there might not be an option when you're taking a survey on left-handedness, for example, for you to indicate whether you are both left-handed and right-handed, or if you just identify as an ambidextrous person who could do either. So your data can already tell you so much more about your values than it does about the world. So, does cleaning data deal with this kind of problem? No, it really doesn't. Cleaning actually only deals with the types of data that makes it hard for the computer to find and make sense of the patterns in the data. So that means things like duplicates or missing values or inconsistent and wrong spelling of data or outliers. These are things that make it difficult for the data set to be treated with machine learning to find the things that you want to find in the data. So for example, an example that everyone might be familiar with is if you were in this class, you might be mad at the person whose favorite color is yellow because they got a 90 where everyone else got much lower. So the teacher could curve the grades, but they're gonna have to take that one out of the running or just say it's not possible because we already have someone who got a 90. So, and I want to point out also right here that this process of looking at data and figuring out what is dirty is not really an easy or quick action that data scientists can take. It's actually been reported consistently over years that data scientists spend about most of their time doing data preparation or processing and cleaning. So what are they really spending their time on, right? Well, so they have to somehow take this data and fix it so that the machine can read it, right? So that could mean removing some data from the data set, changing some of the values, or if it's something that's missing, entering a new value that appears to be plausible, let's say. It could be an average of everything else. It could be the most common value. But depending on the context, what used to be a blank space gets filled with essentially synthetic data. It's actually interesting that this data cleaning is not talked about all that much. However, an entire field of the field of genetics had to deal with this a while back because whenever they would enter the names of genes, it would automatically get converted into a date. So they actually had to rename human genes that they used in research because data cleaning became too hard. Because every time they shared a CSV file, for those who know, the formatting would not follow, which would mean that every time someone opened Excel, they would have to go in and fix all of these. So now I want to kind of go back to the problems that I mentioned earlier, right? I want to take this idea of cleaning and I want to connect it to people because the key here is data very often is people. It represents people or some aspect of you or something around you, which is going to affect you eventually, right? So I also want to say for those of you in the room who might not know what AI is, it can be affecting you without your knowledge when you're going and applying for something because they use AI in hiring in certain cases. It might be used in bank loans or, yes, identifying your shoes. So let's take an example where it's very obvious. There is a data set of asylum seekers in Denmark. And this data set also has the reason the asylum seeker is actually looking for asylum. So essentially their life story, I would say one of the most traumatic things in their life, explained to one of the caseworkers. And then it also has the decision that Denmark gave for why this person's asylum is confirmed or denied. I want to point out these outliers, which were identified using an outlier detection algorithm. So an automatic way to say, oh, these ones are different from the rest. So these examples, one of them is a deaf person who was not able to explain to the caseworker why he wants asylum. He was not able to communicate in any way. So therefore, the column that is supposed to have why he's seeking asylum, it's empty, which obviously is very different from the rest of the data because everyone has something written there. Another one is a mother and her child who both received asylum, but then after a while, the mother's asylum was revoked for some reason. So there's this issue that people have to deal with. But the issue is also here that if you need to clean this data set, what are you going to do with these people with this data? You're either going to have to take it out of the entire data set, meaning that these people are not considered when you create a new solution for something, or you have to rewrite essentially what these people's experiences are, what some of their most traumatic experiences in their life have been, because you want your machine learning model to work. So this is where discard studies comes in. So discard studies starts from waste studies, which deals with things like trash, how it's taken away and destroyed or recycled. But discard studies, different from waste studies, kind of zooms out and it asks, okay, so where else other than trash do we see this kind of behavior? What else do we throw away and remove in a systematic way? Well, as it turns out, they can write an entire book about how it's pretty much everywhere. We get rid of materials, we get rid of practices, regions, and people. You only have to look at what happened with COVID to look at what kinds of people were discarded, essentially. They talk about how discard practices and wasting are techniques of power that create or uphold a system. Now, I'm gonna break that down. So to put that simply, in order to have a clean city, you need to identify something as dirty and, say that it is trash, for example. And to have a clean city, you need to carry it outside of the city because the absence of trash is what makes your city clean. So of course, here, there's a very visual example of how there can be a powerful privileged center that discard studies looks for. And the system that identifies some things as trash and worthless and discardable and takes them out of the center. So to apply this to data and cleaning, it obviously becomes very important to identify also what kinds of data and who make up that powerful center, and what kinds of data and who are the worthless, discarded, dirty data. So this can obviously change with every kind of AI application because things are very context specific, right? What works for a shoe is not going to work for a loan application in a bank. So that is true. However, we also know from research that certain groups have suffered systematically in just about every single part of life. And that includes, for example, Black and Indigenous people, other people of color, women and trans folks, people with disabilities, and various other identity markers, including where you live and your nationality. and this is obviously an extremely limited view, and I don't even have sources here because I could have pulled any kind of statistics for any kind of identity. And I don't think I'm alone in this room when I say this is a known fact. So these groups are also, I want to point out that they are called marginalized, which by definition means they're outliers. They have a reality that is significantly different from others in society. Like, this is what defines them, right? This also likely means that people who are from marginalized groups have data that is different from everyone else as well. So their data, their reality is deemed worthless and unwanted and discarded to uphold a system that already privileges the people who are powerful. So for example, you might have students who come from lower income families or from an immigrant family that doesn't speak the dominant language in that country. You might have students that are absent for health reasons or family reasons. These students would have data that is significantly different from every other student in that classroom and in that school. So if you have someone coming into that school and trying to train an algorithm on that data, your most disadvantaged students might not appear in that data set, which means that the outcomes of that training data set, of that AI trained on that training data set, are not going to consider your most disadvantaged students, leaving them even more disadvantaged. So shouldn't we be paying more attention to whose data gets removed or altered during AI development? Well, I hope your answer is yes, because my argument is that data has a critical role in ethical AI development. And I hope you're on the same page with me now, because now I want to move into trying to see how things at least could be changed or whether they are being challenged. Unfortunately, the answer is that, well, people think about it. They know that data is important, but what they usually end up doing is looking at a particular data set, auditing whether that data set has the right number of people who are in a certain category, etc. Unfortunately, they talk about these problems that could have been avoided if people were a little bit more careful during data curation or preparation or cleaning, but they don't really talk about what people are doing during cleaning, what it is that is being done. But I would argue that the problem also comes from the fact that these AI applications and data cleaning practices have to be very context specific, right? So there are no set standards or frameworks that can apply to every type of data in every context, at least. And like, real work projects are so messy, so dirty, because real life is messy. It's very surprising when you come across a new type of dirty data, because no one teaches about data cleaning. If they do, they use what they call toy data sets, which doesn't really reflect the way that things appear in real life. And I have computer science people nodding, so that makes me feel very good. So what happens is that people who graduate from a degree and then go into this position where they're supposed to be cleaning data most of the day, they don't really know about data cleaning. So what they do is they learn on the job, or they learn from someone who's been there longer or has done a similar project before, right? So this also means there's a lot of uncertainty. So they have to make a lot of case-by-case decisions on whether something is a real accurate piece of data, or it's an error, like a typo that they actually have to fix now. So I'd like to remind you that it takes up a lot of their time, and actually, it's also the least enjoyable part of their job, which makes me feel a little bit sad for data scientists, but also they make a lot of money, so, But the point here is also that, for example, if I have something in my job that I don't really like that much, if it's the least enjoyable part of my work, then I don't want to think about it more. I just want to like take shortcuts, be done with it, go to the next thing. So in a lot of cases, these case-by-case decisions give the data scientists a lot of power, a lot of what we call discretionary power, because it is in their discretion what to do next. Their small decisions can sway the project one way or another, ethically as well as like in terms of efficiency, even if people don't really realize it. So because data cleaning becomes a series of habits and something that people don't really actively think about, the best way to find out how people are actually cleaning data right now and what they consider to be dirty data is to use ethnography, which is a methodology that is based on observing behavior and culture of people in their natural everyday life. Ooh, so I hope you're still with me. And I think our colleagues from the Netherlands are still awake, so I'm really happy about that. But to rephrase my argument, data cleaning really needs to be studied, especially using the discard studies framework and ethnographical methods. And that's why my dissertation project is going to be an ethnographic study of developers and data scientists in the industry, as well as undergraduate students in a computer science or data science degree. And I'm going to be comparing and contrasting how they clean data to figure out how we can build AI systems a little bit more ethically. So I want to thank you, and I would be happy to talk about any of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Pinar, for the very interesting presentation and very admirable slides. I'm humbled by the slides because I can't do anything fancy like that. And I'm humbled that we have computer scientists in the room, so I'll just leave it at that. And as somebody whose computer science in high school consisted of keyboarding at 8 o'clock in the morning, and that's what we called it back then. But anyway, that was the only computer science class I took. One of the questions I was interested in is, I'm quite impressed with the interdisciplinary aspect of your research between LIS and data science and computer science. What brought you here to FIMS? Was there some faculty expertise?
Actually, I have to say, I was working in a position before this, working on sort of fairness and all these related topics. And what we were doing were looking at the outputs of algorithms that were already out there. And, you know, it's really nice to be able to say, oh, we discovered that something is wrong. But what I wanted to do was dig deeper and get into why is it happening? Is there something we can do to prevent it instead of pointing out that it's happening? And when I was collaborating with people who were training, for example, image recognition algorithms like the ones that recognize shoes, we treated a data set that we had very differently. So that started a little line of thought in my head that said, why are we looking at data differently? Isn't it supposed to be objective? Which it really isn't. I hope you agree. So, and I discovered Luke and Joanna's work here, which is why I came to Western.
Well, very good, very good. Western and FIMS is all the much richer to have you. Thank you very much. And so if you're any online attendees, if you have any questions, raise your hand and Matt will let us know. And those of you in person, raise your physical hand. Not your computer hand, but your physical hand. And yes.
Thank you for your talk. Fascinating stuff. I hadn't thought about this aspect so much, and I'm quite flabbergasted by 60% of the time of data scientists spent on this. I was wondering, as you say, these data scientists are often well paid, and I also know that a lot of the more boring work gets outsourced to gig workers over Amazon Turk. And does that happen here too, or do you know anything about that?
So one of the struggles also with me finding my case study location is that technology companies don't talk about what they do. But we do know that they use platforms like Mechanical Turk or I think Crowdflower is what it used to be called. Now it's Figure 8. These platforms where you can give very little payment for someone somewhere out there in the world to label your data, for example. But as far as I know, that's as far as it goes. And then the cleaning is actually happening in-house. So they wouldn't really use the same kind of people to clean the data set because cleaning also requires you to know what you're going to use the data for. And when you outsource these things, the people who are paid very little, they are sort of generalists. You know, they might be someone who works in a factory and then comes home and wants to make a few more dollars. So you don't know what their specialty is very much of the time. Although, of course, you can also outsource to experts, but that's another can of worms.
Pinar, thank you so much. Lovely to hear you talk. Great presentation. My question is basically if we're thinking about AI in the sense that we can't have a one-size-fits-all training for our data set collection, then most likely, do we think that the kind of conclusion of this is that we'll need very specific contextually like situated solutions to training and to like workplace environments? And then if that's the case, do you have any plans or hopes to do outputs for training?
So I'll go backwards. I hope by the end of this, I will have a very good understanding of what happens and how people think in both undergraduate education and in the industry, which would mean that I can give some sort of advice or guiding document to people, either directly to people or to policymakers who affect both of these things. But the issue is that, yeah, I think that people, when they're starting a project, have to, at the very beginning, involve people who know about the social context. They need to get social scientists and humanities and arts and community-based experts, because sometimes the answer isn't getting someone to sort of put the context onto your data. It's to question, is AI necessary in that context? And a lot of times the answer is no, but because companies don't want to hear that because they're going to be making money off of it, it usually comes later, and it usually comes in the form of someone who's called like an ethics officer or something like that, who has to just say, yes, this is approved. And then when something goes wrong, that's the person that they fire and not the people that did the grunt work.
Right.
That's a depressing but hopefully realistic answer.
Yeah, it is. Thank you.
I have one more question, if I may.
Go ahead.
And thank you for your slides. I'm also humbled by them all the way from Europe. So thank you very much for that. I had a question, which is that, do you think that maybe computer science is too technical still on this topic, that data cleaning is a societal issue, and that we need to, for computer scientists to understand the problem in data cleaning, they need more education from social sciences? Is that the direction of this research, or?
I think that's a very, that's the kind of question that you might flip and say, well, you know, an HR person should probably know about accounting so that they know what to do. But the truth is that if you have an accountant, you don't need to teach your HR person about accounting.
No.
So in the same way, I think that, sure, a little bit of social science education would benefit everyone, just as a little bit of STEM education benefits people who are doing social science. But I don't think we need, or that we can, teach computer scientists enough social science to make them understand the systemic issues that people study for years in social science programs. So I think the better solution is to find someone who has done that work, who is engaged with the community and collaborate.
So involving the right people and they, yeah.
Instead of getting computer scientists to do something that they're not trained to do, instead of giving them like 3 months of a workshop, get someone who's done it for 10 years.
Whenever someone asks, not so much what I'm doing for a PhD, but why, I always say a little bit of social science doesn't hurt. And then my dad stopped talking to me for the rest of the evening. Janica.
Yeah, thank you, Pinar. This is grown. I crashed her reading group class in the fall, so we talked about a lot of this. And so, but as you're talking, because it strikes me that like in data in research context, and I'm like thinking like say like atmospheric science or chemistry, people clean their data, but they usually have like a clear like framing and documentation. Not always, but sometimes. No, so yeah, not always, but sometimes. About like those decisions that are being made and why, and even if that data is like cleaned out, sometimes later it's still retrievable if they realize that was something that was important for whatever reason. Is that like something that happens in the industry and like machine learning context, that type of documentation and reasons for cleaning data? And then like, and I'm like wondering too, like who makes those decisions? Because maybe building on that last question, like is that the place where the social scientists should be, or?
Two things. Let me repeat your question so I don't forget, because I start talking and I do. So the first thing is, does it also happen in research contexts, right? Because they have all these frameworks, etc. And then do they have frameworks in industry? And then, yeah, the second thing is, do industry workers also have sort of versioning almost, trying to go back to what the data looked like before it was cleaned, essentially? Is that?
Yeah, I think even more so like who's making those decisions and how are those documents applied?
Okay, so for the first question, I would like to remind you of the book that we both read during the reading course that you crashed. So in, I believe, chapter 8 of raw data is an oxymoron. It was recent, otherwise I would not be able to cite this chapter. They do an ethnographic study of people who are taking longitudinal study measurements of some kind of like river. And they talk about how people can go out and learn how to collect that data. And that's very, the procedure is written down very clearly, but there's a line there that I will never forget, which is that experience teaches you how to identify an outlier, because it's really the people who have done it a lot of times that say, oh, that change is not the kind of change that we want to see over time. That's an error. That is not true. So in a research study, you do have these versions. I think also in health sciences, they have that as a habit, but in the industry, there's a paper, I want to say it's from Data Cascades, but I might be wrong, where there's a participant that says, in terms of documentation, what I would really love to see is what the data set looked like before. Because what happens is also that people don't build their data sets. They look for data sets built by others. And that data set put out there is already cleaned in very basic ways. So there's already a lot of values that were put in there and you have no idea what the data looks like before. So it doesn't really exist. And I don't know who makes the decisions because they don't really tell us anything.
When you're talking about data cleaning, are you talking about only data like after it's been recorded, or also at like the data collection, initial data collection? Because that chapter I was also referencing like even writing it down in the first place.
Well, it's interesting. So I think the reason my work is going to add anything to the literature is because a lot of work on data creation, so actually writing and measuring, has been done in the sciences, and they haven't really done that in AI context. And I have a feeling it's because a lot of times they just kind of either outsource it or they get a data set that's already ready or something like that. So I think what I want to focus on is people cleaning. So that could mean they get a data set and they have no idea where it comes from, which is extra interesting because they have no idea what the context is. When you know the context, you might have some other things that come to mind, but when you get it from a stranger from another part of the world, what do you think is the error? What do you think is an outlier?
Context is everything. Matt, is there anybody online?
Yes, two.
Thank you.
Just one second. Grant, if you can hear us, you can go ahead. Should be.
Yep, thanks, thanks, Matt. Thank you, Pinar. This was really interesting. I was struck by the slide which showed that data cleaning is the least popular activity of data scientists. When I think, yeah, the least enjoyable part of data science. When I think back through my lurid past to the various jobs I've held, I remember having parts of my job which I hated. And I found that I hated them not because they were difficult, not even because they were boring, but because they were impossible. That I was being asked to do something which was fundamentally impossible and to pretend that it was and to sustain an illusion. And I'm wondering, is it possible that this kind of data cleaning is fundamentally impossible? That there are always, in a system which relies on probability prediction, there are always going to be outliers. There are always going to be people left behind. No matter how often you say no one is left behind, there always will be. And is it possible that there's a cynicism that pervades data cleaning from the simple fact that people are being asked to do something which they know is never going to be satisfactory?
Thank you. That's a really interesting question. First of all, by one of my favorite quotes about statistics and machine learning is, all models are wrong, but some are useful, which I think also parallels how the discard studies authors talk about things, because they talk about, in their introduction especially, they make it very clear that their argument is never that things should not be discarded because they think that's unrealistic, because that's how our systems work, but that discarding well needs to be thought out very carefully. So that would mean that when you discard things, like when you think about our current climate crisis, it's because our waste, our discarding was not thought through, and it ended up with all these consequences that we now have to deal with. So what discard studies argues, and what I'm trying to do, hopefully by the end of this project, is to find out enough about the data cleaning process that I know why it's not enjoyable. Why do they see it in this way? And how do they think about data cleaning? Is it that they think it's impossible? Or do they not really think about whether it is possible and just focus on, is it making my model work? Because when people talk about this kind of statistic that it takes up most of their time and they don't like it, it's kind of like a given. No one's really done research on why people don't like it, because it's kind of assumed that it's tedious, it's boring, and people enjoy the model making part a lot more. I don't know if that's true, but hopefully in a couple of years I will.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And Matt, you said there was someone else online as well?
Yes, one sec. Their hand is down now. If you want to raise your hand again, and oh, there you are. Kes? Should be able to unmute and turn on your video.
And
Okay. I don't know if you can see me.
We can hear you.
Okay, that's fine. So good evening. It's evening here in the UK. So I like the presentation. I've never really thought about it in that data cleaning in that way. But I have a question. Because oftentimes when we're trying to take care of account for outliers, and ensure that our biases are taken care of, we end up also introducing our own biases. So my question to you is, as a researcher, how do you intend to approach this project, knowing that you have your biases? Do you intend to try to mitigate your own biases, or do you want to include your biases in the project? How do you want to take care of your biases for this project?
Thank you. That's a great question, and I'm glad you asked that because we were just talking about this earlier in the day. So I come from a social sciences and humanities background, and I'm primarily working in ethnography. So anthropology has a good tradition of the researcher being reflexive, which means they sort of acknowledge and keep in mind who they are, what background they come from, what lens they look through. So I'm hoping to do that myself. And of course, I think we all try to, as researchers, mitigate our own biases, but I think people would be kidding themselves if they think they're doing a good job of it. Because I think there is no way to look at things objectively because we are still people. You might just be a person whose lens is someone who's trying not to be biased, which is still a lens, which is still a bias. It just leans towards what you think is objective, which might not match someone else's. So I believe I will include sort of a disclaimer at the beginning as well of my work saying, this is my background, this is the kind of tradition that I come from academically, even my own country and the places that I've been in, because those things really impact the way that I think about things. I mean, we just name dropped Europe. I'm European, I'm from Cyprus, but my undergraduate degree was in the US. So who can say what my habits actually represent, you know? So I need to make sure that I'm keeping those in mind and that my readers are keeping that in mind. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. Because listening to you, I was thinking, okay, is she positivist? Is she interpretivist?
No,
What lens? Yes. What lens is she using to look at this? And so, okay, all right, that's good. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. And maybe we'll do Joanna, and then we'll come to you. Thank you.
Okay. Go ahead.
Hi, Pinar. Thanks so much for the talk. I think it was fantastic. And I haven't seen you work with discard studies before. And so this is really exciting to me. And I don't know if this is a question as much of it as a comment, but I think that you got me thinking about Joseph Turo's work, kind of the early critiques around uses of big data. And one of his concerns was the way in which marketers were using data in order to separate, he was focusing on Americans, but to separate Americans into like targets or waste, right? Essentially defining like Americans as waste if they weren't desirable targets for marketing purposes. And so I just think it's really interesting how your work in connection with what he was identifying at that time, which of course has continued, is that you're kind of identifying this process at the very beginning, and he's talking about it as kind of an end output to, like, it's happening in both these stages. And anyway, that just struck me as a really interesting parallel, a really important one. And I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, or I mean, it can just be left as a comment, I guess, whatever you like. But a fantastic presentation, and you really got me thinking. Thanks so much.
Thank you. I will have to get that source from you because I haven't really looked into it in that angle. And I have to say, for everyone here, Joanna has been a huge help throughout this entire process. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. And we have a couple questions. I don't know yourself, sir.
Yeah, half remark as well. I am one of the aforementioned computer scientists, and until not very long ago, I was a data scientist. Where I wonder, which is mostly a question for the future, how honest these people are in determining what cleaning data is. Because for me, for the most part, when I was a data scientist, cleaning data was the part of building a model when it wasn't working yet, when it wasn't doing what I wanted it to do. And it was, well, some part of my data must be bad because I'm a great modeler and my model must work. So cleaning data is throwing out things that makes my model not work until the model works. I feel like something along this line makes it not enjoyable because it's banging your head against the wall until it sticks. And it makes it a large part of the time because once it works, you're done. So I feel like some question like this, are they actually cleaning the data or are they just breaking their model? Might be interesting to look into at some point, how honest they are being in that regard.
That's a great way to put it, because that makes me think the data cleaning doesn't end until there's no more problem solving, which means that dirty data and the people who are breaking your model are problems, which is an interesting perspective that I'd like to explore.
There's a lot happening with the words here.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the presentation. Fascinating talk, really. I'm amazed by the approach that you are taking, and also the discard studies framework. We're talking about the theoretical framework it's really interesting. My question is like, are there any research, or are you aware of any research like how this dirty data may influence the model, if they were included in the model, or it's not just possible to include them in the model, and or they will break the model, or the model should be different if we want to include those data. So it's like a question with a follow-up question to Tim.
I mean, I have to say this is a question better answered by a computer scientist, because all I know is that they do data cleaning and this is the type of data they do it on. But as far as I know, like duplicates run the risk of making it seem like this data is more important than it is when it's only one person who said this. But now it's going to appear like 2 people said it, like 3 people said it. And like something that's empty might actually break. You might just get, I can't run your model because you're expecting a value and getting nothing. And then in the eyes of the machine, yes, bilingual is a different answer than yes. It's different, like no is different than ESL, even though for a person, those would be the same thing. So it all, sorry, English is a second language. So there's also another point that I was gonna make was that people use abbreviations or words that you might not know. So there's all sorts of things that could affect your model in very different ways. Like, and depending on context, like they're gonna have very different results.
And is there any stage like after data cleaning that the data scientists like really like think through like what data were thrown away, like the dirty data? Like
as far as I know, so as we just heard, data cleaning really ends when your model works. Exactly. And when your model works, you don't really need the data because you needed the training data to train. Yeah. So once you're done with training, you're done with the training data. You might still use some to test, but then you're essentially done with the training. Yeah. There are certain complications where you have like a model that's constantly updating, which means that the people who are using your system give it more training data. And then you have like feedback loops and all the things that I didn't want to include because I have people like my mom in the audience. Yeah.
Yes, you're so sorry.
Yeah, I don't want to talk to me. Okay. Yeah, again, fascinating stuff. But I was wondering sometimes, I've seen examples, we know it, I understand it intuitively. Sometimes when you fill in forms, there's not enough options. For instance, old-fashioned forms where you can only choose male or female as gender. This seems somewhat related. Sometimes what may seem as dirty is because perhaps the options that were given were not broad enough. and you probably understand
Yes.
much better than me what I'm actually thinking of. So I was wondering, do you have thoughts about this?
Oh, so many.
unmatured thought?
Oh, so many. I'm gonna start by saying I'm from Cyprus and I'm from North Cyprus, which for those of you who don't know, is a country that's not recognized anywhere in the world except for Turkey because it's under occupation. So it's a de facto nation, which means that if I'm filling out a form to, for example, if I'm getting something from Amazon, I have to fill in a country there, right? The problem is, even though I'm in Cyprus, if I put Cyprus there, it's going to assume South Cyprus, which means it's going to go into the south. What I have to do in reality is put in Turkey, because then we can get our packages through Turkey. What's happening there is not that I'm in the wrong place or the form is weird, it's that the social reality I live in means that the place where I live, North Cyprus, is not represented in this list. So it's not really something that can also be fixed just by updating your form, because the form relies on standards and international agreements and all these things that inform everything else. And related to that, this person whose talk is great, and I think you took a note, I think it would be really great for you. Their argument was that, what if instead of taking out the outliers, we use them to learn more about our data set and our model, because these people's cases, they could actually be used to find out where the problems are. In all of these cases, the people's applications had to be returned and looked at again. So that might be a good way to find a problem in your system that you can work on better. I don't know if that answers your question or just generates more questions, but.
Yeah, thanks for this, Pinar. I think one thing you totally explained my life with Excel to me. Data cleaning, and that's why I hate it so much. And but I was listening to you talk, and I remember I once had to do, it was an administrative task, distributing a sliver of people's base pay, all my 800 colleagues, and I had to do it compared against a statistical database. It's not worth going into all the things I did, but yeah, I was modeling, I was cleaning the data, I was having to make judgments about outliers and not outliers, and doing everything you say. Nobody would describe what I was doing as AI. So I'm just interested in how AI is the kind of latest version of all these problems where they're surfacing. But are you planning on, how do you want to frame this? Because in some ways it applies to a lot of statistical uses of statistics in general.
Oh, definitely.
In social affairs. So,
actually, that's why so much of my work is informed by STS, so Science and Technology Studies, because people have been looking at how, for example, researchers construct their data sets, how they use statistics, how it can be misused. So there's definitely a lot of work that I'm building on that have looked at it in different contexts, and a lot of work now looking at AI with other aspects of this. What I think is interesting is that AI has it sounds very big and it sounds very fancy, and it gets all the grant funding and all the angel investors flock to AI. And the data, especially data cleaning, gets forgotten once you have your results, once you go into the market. So I think that's why I want to focus on AI, specifically how data is cleaned in AI, also because when you're a researcher, you have a certain institution that you're a part of that has policies maybe on the national level, sometimes on the international level, that guide what you're doing, standards that you have to follow. With AI, you can just kind of do whatever you want, and if people are willing to buy it, you can sell it. Simple as that.
The gentleman in the striped shirt,
Yeah, Lisa.
I think we'll, well, go ahead, then I'll come back to this.
Your example of growth was really interesting. It reminded me, there's this bit of a genre of blog posts that programmers have written called falsehoods programmers believe about X, right?
I've seen that.
Like that they believe about names, that they believe about time. I think that really plays well with what you're talking about, because things that just seem like there's somehow deviations from a formalizable norm actually might just represent actually messy social realities, but you cannot help but see it as a bug when you're dealing with it in a certain context, using when you're saying about your computer, trying to get your code to work. Time zones is another one. There's like an official document on like time zones, like this one's the same name. If you go to like the actual internet standards body and look at the documentation, it'll be like an email from 15 years ago that says, you know, in this part of the country, we think they still use this, but we don't know. It's amazing how messy this stuff can be.
I mean, the simplest examples people can think of are name, age, gender, country.
Yeah.
People can have only one name in certain countries like Burma. People can have a different age than the one that you think. In Korea, they actually start counting from 1 instead of 0 when you're born. You know, country, as I explained, people can live in countries that don't appear in the list. You know, gender, we already know, is very complex. So even the things that we think are basic are so messy in real life. And social scientists know this.
Yeah, great.
Computer scientists would like to think it's just a checkbox.
I will retain my age by counting from 1. Lisa?
I think this has been great, likewise the conversation. And I've done lots of data cleaning, but no one would call it AI, just in SPSS many years ago. But my question, I'm really struck that data cleaners are people, so I'm really thinking of, you know, cleaning linen, and what becomes of people's job is clean data. But surely there is somebody somewhere trying to figure out how data cleaning can be automated. In our conversation, all the data cleaners are people making decisions about something that was automated and early remote. But and maybe that's just a hall of mirrors where presumption gets built in multiple layers and becomes finally irretrievable, uncleanable, you know, permanently dirty, or people who are kind of different. And so the person as the cleaner, is that, how long is that going to last?
I hope for a long time, but I can't say it will last a long time because, you know, there are already a lot of ways that people have tried to automate things because people don't like that part of the job and they're computer scientists, so they can try to build a tool to not do what they need to do. But the problems with the problems that make data dirty are the same ones that are going to appear in an automated way to clean data. So the real question is, how much is our society and our policies and our, you know, criminal system, how much are all of these going to allow these kinds of practices to flourish? You know, are we going to have standards that say you should not be cleaning your data automatically? You should have a person checking? I don't know. I am pessimist, I guess, but I'm gonna say no.
And to avoid the bias that people have been bringing to judgment forever.
I mean, I have to say there's like a little push and pull where people go, oh, people are biased, so we need to use algorithms. And then they say, oh, algorithms are biased, so we need to bring in people to check. And then you just kind of go in a circle until you can get enough money to fund one of those things. And you go, this is the real one.
Yeah, as a researcher, I've learned everyone is biased except for me. So JP, then Danica, thank you.
Obviously, I talked to you both before, like this is super useful when it comes to any type of data set, in my opinion. I'm curious, so I think that your slide with like the people that were missing out shows like it resembles survivorship bias, which is like when it comes to like the whole idea of like in World War II, these planes were getting shot down, and then anytime the planes came back, they were like, oh, it's the wings that keep getting hit. But then they realized that it wasn't the wings getting hit is the problem. It's that everything else was getting hit, but all those places were just like all those planes just ended up like falling, crashing, and they weren't accounted for. And then we realized the potential like, this is how we can fix the system. So I'm wondering what you think that, the benefits are, or like, what's your intended goal for like the research to come out of it? And also like even, I think about just recently with the whole, Gemini scandal with Google and like, the oversampling of, like like trying to like hide certain communities and overrepresent certain communities and like this fundamental issue that comes with that, and like inherently AI art could be problematic. So I just want to see where you feel like your research should lead and maybe where it should even be implemented in certain models or support certain types of industries.
So I'm at a point where I'm looking at data cleaning in the literature, and what I'm finding is that I don't have enough to build on to say this is what should be done, because there's so much that we don't know about data cleaning. So my goal for hopefully a doable goal for the PhD, as I've been told, is to do one little thing, which is to figure out what people do with cleaning, how people think about cleaning. And then hopefully from there will be certain obvious ways that we can make things better. But I think there's a lot of other things to consider with things like Gemini, where I think big tech is always rushing to, beat the competitors or do something else to get money. So there's a lot of other things that need to be fixed. It's not just data sampling and data cleaning that is the issue. So I don't know, that's not an answer really, but the point is that real life is too messy and too complex for a simple answer.
Daniel.
So just listening to everybody, this is super half-baked and maybe it'll be ridiculous, especially to the computer scientists. But like, it strikes me when we're talking about data cleaning and like your whole discussion around discard studies, and removal or changing of what's already there. Have you ever come across anything about like fixing or cleaning and stuff by like adding to it? Because even with JP's like example, like there's issues of over-representation, but usually privilege, like the already represented. Like, is that ever something people talk about, like, when we're talking about, like, your example of asylum, the marginalized, the underrepresented?
Yeah, and again, the computer scientists can speak to this a little bit more, but I know there are techniques to de-bias certain models or data sets. And a lot of times that means if you're talking about representation, it's figuring out who doesn't have enough representation to get the same kind of benefit as other social groups, and then giving that group more representation so that the outputs can be a little more accurate. But again, there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all kind of add this so that you can do it better solution, because again, there are so many other things that we need to talk about. If you can get your algorithm to be great for different races, genders, countries, abilities, you might still get people who are left-handed that struggle with your stuff. Like, you're not going to be able to think of everything, but a social scientist who's guiding you through that process, I'm sure could think of things that are relevant and, tell you what to add or what to look for, at least.
And Daniel?
This is a ridiculous question.
To Daniel for a ridiculous question.
So I was thinking about at least what was said, and it's been like House of Mirrors, and data cleaning is going to be another automated process. To which I thought, have you thought about what ChatGPT can do in this?
Oh no.
And to elaborate, I'm being a little facetious, but as I'm sure you've encountered already, and why it's so valuable that your work is looking at how computer scientists are educated and trained, is that a lot of the anxiety in the computer science world, the sense I get from a pedagogical point of view, is that so many of their students, it's such an easy solution to say, how do I do this program? Only ask ChatGPT and give me the code, and then I can do that. And similarly, maybe it's a weird kind of automation because it's not quite what I think Lisa was talking about, but there's a sense that some of the kind of intellectual labor is being outsourced to like a large language model. And so I'm curious if you've kind of thought, but maybe it's a more common-sense question. Sorry to end on that, but have you thought about that? And maybe could you talk a little bit more about maybe what you've kind of learned about computer scientists training and students in general, and why you think that's an important population to look at
Well, you know, I've thought about ChatGPT a lot and it's made me angry. I'm actually, for the FIMS folks in the group, I'm starting a new project working on how undergraduate students use and think about language-based models like ChatGPT, because we don't really know how they're doing things. We're just kind of talking about it on an administrative level. So I don't know if people are using it, but I would imagine if they give a certain number of data points and say, can you clean this for me? What ChatGPT is going to do is look at, for example, because ChatGPT uses a lot of web pages, it's going to probably spit out something that someone on like Reddit might answer to a question like that, which might be taking a few of the data points and saying, oh, you should probably take these out, or you should change these. It's not going to be anything that makes sense, maybe, because what it's not doing is understanding your question. What it's doing is comparing it to similar questions and giving you a similar answer. It's the same way that it might not be able to do 2 + 2, because it doesn't really have a concept of what you're asking it to do. What it's doing is just comparing. So in that sense, students could, yes, exactly. In that sense, students could ask ChatGPT, how do I clean data, as a broad question, and yeah, get all the right ways to clean data, because a lot of blog posts have talked about it in steps. So ChatGPT might give a correct answer, but what it's not going to be able to do is know what it means, or be able to suggest the right cleaning way for your specific context, for your specific data.
This is another literary classic, Brave New World. Speaking of ChatGPT, any other questions in person? And then Matt, do you have anyone online?
Yeah, one more.
One
Cass?
more. Or is it a legacy hand?
Yeah. Hello. Yeah.
Hi.
Yeah. Last question, I promise. Okay. You mentioned discretionary powers of those that clean data, and how they could have discretion to decide what to exclude or what to include. So my question is, do you think discretionary power is totally bad? should we take discretionary power away from them, or is it something that is both good and bad? Or how do you intend to? So what's the place of discretionary power? Because I think when you even have standards, this is my thoughts. When you have standards and you have an algorithm that takes care of so many things, there are still some things that are not taken care by those algorithms, and at some point you still need discretionary power to include things that may have been overlooked and not included. But what are your thoughts about that? Discretionary powers of those that clean data?
Yeah. Honestly, I don't think about discretionary power as good or bad. I think about it as something like a flag that tells me this is somewhere to look at, because I think there's a lot of people making a lot of decisions that cannot be generalized or cannot follow standards all the way. There's always going to be discretionary power, because there's always going to be context specificity that cannot be informed by frameworks or standards. You know, it's not like gravity that works the same everywhere if you take into account all the other forces. It's like a student in a certain classroom is going to have a situation that even the best thought out frameworks can't address. So you are going to have discretionary power anyway. So I think of it as more of like a marker of where to pay attention to, and to see if we can put any guardrails around things that show up in every person's case-by-case considerations, as opposed to, you know, things that really are unique. So right now what's happening is probably that we're giving discretionary power to different people over the same exact situations, because no one is talking about data cleaning quite in that way. I hope that makes sense.
It does. Thanks for clarifying.
Thank you.
This has certainly been a very erudite audience, an active audience, some wonderful questions. Just a reminder, mediations is our graduate student sponsored, or graduate student run talk, by mostly showcasing graduate students here at the Faculty of Information and Media Studies. Our next mediation event will be taking place on April 11th. Emily Hutchinson, a PhD student in biology, Megan Bull, a PhD student in media studies, and a surgeon, Mark Ambrosio, yours truly, will be co-presenting on disseminating academic research on air. We're all participating in a radio show / podcast on Radio Western, and yes, Western has a radio station, called Gradcast, and which academic research is shared, and Brittany was a member of that. I followed up Brittany's illustrious footsteps onto the show, then Brittany decided to leave. But anyways, that's our next event, so please come out. Mark likes to have an audience. More importantly, thank you to Matt for the tech expertise. Thank you to the rest of the mediations committee. Thank you to the many students who are here, the faculty members. Thank you to Dean Lisa Henderson and the faculty for sponsoring this event. And thank you to Pinar.
A round of applause, because it is her birthday.
Yes, you're
No.
I need 0, 0. Yeah, we're supposed to.
Oh, yeah, right.
Waste management.
I like getting.
But it's not. Sorry.
As soon as I-
Now I don't understand.